Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing stories ever to traverse the dusty back roads of the countryside. Please let us know where you're watching us from now, because what we're about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about what's real and what's not. This video is a work of fiction, created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Imagine a road lost in the Ozarks Mountains of Missouri. The year is 1917, and the world outside is ablaze with the Great War. But here, in this forgotten corner of America, time seems to stand still in a different way. The trees close in on the trails like intertwined fingers, and the morning mist creeps across the ground like something alive. It is in this setting that two travelers, a couple passing through, will experience something that defies any logical explanation. They came from Springfield, heading south, looking for work in the sawmills that were still operating near the Arkansas border. Their names don't matter as much as what happened that night. She was a seamstress. He had experience with wood. Ordinary people, people who believed in what they saw and touched, people who never imagined that reality could bend in that way. At that time of year, the afternoon went by quickly, and they knew they wouldn't get to their destination before dark. The roads were treacherous, full of loose stones and exposed roots. Their horse was tired, and the cart creaked at every pothole. That's when they saw smoke rising between the trees, a thin wisp of light gray against the darkening sky. Where there's smoke, there are people. There is shelter where there are people. They followed the smoke and turned off the main trail onto a side path that looked like it had been used a lot. The wheel tracks were deep in the ground, which meant that other people had been there recently. This made them feel better. No one expects to find the impossible on a busy road. After a sharp turn, the cabin came into view. It was made of dark logs and had a roof made of uneven planks. It looked strong and old, like a place that has seen many generations come and go. The stone chimney let out a lot of smoke, and the cracks in the window let in orange light. They got off the cart and walked slowly towards them, as is usual in the country. Be careful when you knock on a stranger's door at night. The man knocked 3 times, firmly but politely. There was no answer. He hit it again. Be quiet. But the door was not locked, and when he pushed it gently, it opened with a groan from the rusty hinges. Everything inside looked like it was lived in. There was a table with dirty dishes, leftover food that was still warm, pots hanging on the wall, a rocking chair by the fireplace where the fire was still crackling low, folded blankets in one corner, and muddy boots by the door. There was no doubt that someone lived there. But where were they? They called, waited, and called again. Nothing. The trees whispered as the wind blew outside, and the feeling that someone was watching them grew stronger with each passing second. But fear was stronger than exhaustion. It was cold at night. The horse needed to rest, and they had no choice. They did not leave. They took care of the fire, ate what they had brought, and then lay down under the blankets they found. The woman said it was strange that the door didn't have a lock before she went to bed. Her husband said that people in the country trust their neighbors. She didn't seem sure, but she fell asleep quickly. It was a deep, heavy sleep that felt like it was pulling you down. The first thing they noticed when they woke up was the cold. It was a different kind of cold than the night before, and it was very cold. The second thing was the light, a lot of light, too much light for a cabin that was closed. The third detail changed everything. They didn't have a roof over their heads. There were no walls around them. There wasn't a door, a window, or a chimney. They were lying in the middle of an open space, covered by the same blankets, with only trees and sky around them. The cabin was gone, and so was any proof that the night before had really happened. The couple got up slowly, still wrapped in the blankets they had found the night before. They were there, real, rough to the touch, and smelled like wood smoke. But all around where the dark log cabin should have been, there was only tall grass swaying in the morning breeze. The trees made a perfect circle around the clearing, as if someone had planted them there on purpose to mark an invisible line. The woman put her hands on the ground and looked for any signs of a foundation, burned wood, or anything else that would show that the building had been there. Nothing. The ground was untouched, with moss and fallen leaves on it that looked like they had been there for years. There weren't even any ashes from the fireplace where the fire had burned all night. The husband walked around the edge of the clearing, mentally measuring where the door, window, and walls were. He walked slowly and carefully, as if he still thought he would find something solid that his eyes couldn't see. At that point, he saw something strange. The cart was still tied to a tree at the edge of the clearing, just like they had left it. The horse grazed peacefully, as if nothing strange had happened, but the distance was off. They had left the cart a few steps from the cabin door the night before. Now, it was at least 20 meters away from where they had slept, as if the world had changed overnight, keeping some things and getting rid of others. The woman started to walk in circles, breathing quickly, looking for a reason that made sense. Maybe they had slept somewhere else. Maybe they had walked around in their sleep and woke up far from the cabin. But the blankets were there, and they remembered perfectly falling asleep by the fire and listening to the wood crackle as it burned. Their memories were too clear for it to be a shared dream. The sun rose quickly, bringing heat and light, but not comfort. They chose to look for the path that had brought them there. They could get back to the main road and leave that place behind if they could find the side path with the deep wheel tracks. But when they got to where the trail should have been, all they saw was thick bushes, tangled branches, and a lot of other plants that looked like they hadn't been touched in a long time. The man tried to make a way with his hands by breaking branches and pushing aside leaves. The plants were tough, wet, and covered in dew. He stopped after a few minutes. He scratched his hands and realized he was getting farther and farther away from the clearing and into a forest he didn't know. The woman called back to him, her voice shaking. They needed to calm down and think. They went back to where the horse was and tried to figure out where they were by looking at the sun. They knew they had come from the north and needed to go south, but the forest around them was too uniform and didn't have any landmarks they could see. The trees all looked the same, the shadows all blended together, and the quiet was too much. There were no birds singing or insects buzzing. The wind was always there and cold, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. That's when they saw the footprints. They didn't belong to them. Heavy boots had left their footprints in the soft ground near the clearing. They moved in a circle, as if someone had walked around the area where they slept several times, always staying the same distance apart. The couple looked at each other, and the fear they had been holding back until then started to spill out. Someone had been there at night. Someone had watched them while they slept, unaware and without protection. The woman wanted to leave right away, but her husband insisted on following the footprints. Maybe they would lead to the person who did this, or at least to someone who could explain what was going on. They quickly got the cart ready, put the blankets that seemed to be the only physical evidence of the cabin away, and started to follow the trail. The footprints took them out of the clearing and through the trees on a path that looked like it was going in circles. As they went on, the environment changed more and more. The trees got taller and older, and their trunks were so thick that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. The thick canopy blocked most of the sunlight, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves that muffled all sound. The footprints kept going, always in front of you and always visible, as if they wanted to be followed. Then, at some point, they just stopped. There was nothing else, just a round patch of hard-packed earth that was completely smooth and had no plants on it. There was a piece of burned wood in the middle of that area, buried in the ground. It looked like a piece of a beam with hand-carved marks on it. The man got down on his knees and touched the wood. Even though it was cold, the smell of smoke was strong. He was sure it was the same wood from the cabin. The man thought the burned wood had some kind of leftover energy because it seemed to pulse in his hands. He flipped it over to look at the carvings that made strange shapes. They weren't normal decorations. They looked like letters, but they were from an alphabet he had never seen before. The woman came up and asked to see, but when she touched the blackened surface, a sudden heat shot through her fingers. She let go of the wood right away, and the two of them watched as it fell to the ground, making a small cloud of dust. They could hear their own breathing because it was so quiet around them. The horse, which had been following along without question, started to show signs of being nervous. It pulled on the reins, shook its head, and its eyes were wide open like animals do when they feel scared. The man tried to calm it down by rubbing its neck, but that only made things worse. The horse stepped back a few times, almost tipping the cart over. Then they heard it, a low, deep sound that seemed to come from below the ground. It wasn't really a sound, but a vibration that they felt deep in their bones, like the sound of something huge moving in the depths. The couple moved away from the middle of the circular clearing and into the trees for safety. The noise went on for a few seconds that felt like forever. Then it stopped just as suddenly as it had started. They waited, their hearts racing, but nothing else happened. The forest fell back into its heavy silence. The man looked up at the sky to see how much time they had lost. The sun was already higher than it should be, maybe close to noon. He was sure they had gotten up early, but now it felt like hours had gone by in the blink of an eye. The clock wasn't working right in that place. The woman told them to give up everything and just pick a direction to go in. Any direction, as long as it got them out of there. But the man couldn't stop looking at the burned wood. He felt drawn to it in some way, like if he could figure out what those symbols meant, everything would make sense. He picked it up again, ignoring the heat that made him feel bad, and put it inside his shirt. Maybe they could show it to someone who could read those signs when they got out of there. They went back to the wagon and chose to go the other way from where the footprints had come from. There had to be an exit if someone had walked around them like that, going in and out of the woods. It made sense, but it seemed like using logic there was getting less and less useful. Still, it was all they had. As they moved forward, the plants started to change. The old trees were replaced by younger pines, and the ground got rougher and more uneven, with stones covered in lichen. The smell of wet earth and rotting plants filled the air, and it got more humid. It was like they were walking through different parts of the forest, each with its own mood and personality. They came to a stream after an amount of time that neither of them could measure. The water flowed smoothly over the rounded stones, making a sound that finally broke the silence. The horse was thirsty and pulled toward the water. They let it drink while they rested for a bit. The woman wet her hands and face and felt better as the cool water touched her skin. The husband did the same thing, and for a moment, they could almost believe that it had all been a weird dream. But when he looked at the water flowing, he saw something that made his stomach turn. There was a building shape reflected on the surface behind them. He turned around quickly, but there was nothing there except trees. He looked at the water once more. The picture was still there, clear and distinct, a dark log cabin with smoke coming out of the chimney, just like the night before. He pointed to the reflection and called to the woman. She looked and saw the same thing. Both of them stood still, watching that impossible thing. The cabin was in the water, but not in the real world. It was like the stream was showing something from a different time, a different place, or maybe just a different layer of the same reality. The woman slowly reached out and touched the water's surface. The reflection shook and changed shape, but it didn't go away. The man had an idea that even he thought was crazy. He picked up a rock from the ground and threw it into the water, right in the middle of the cabin's reflection. The stone splashed in and sank, and for a moment the picture was gone. But when the water calmed down, the reflection came back, and this time it showed something different. The cabin door was open, and a dark, shapeless figure was standing in the doorway, just watching. They quickly left the stream and went back to the cart. The horse also seemed to know something was wrong because it was restless again and snorted and stomped its hooves on the ground. They had to leave quickly, but which way should they go? Should I follow the stream? It had to go somewhere. Rivers always go somewhere. But what if this stream was not the same? What if it took them deeper into that forest that was impossible? The man made the choice. They would swim against the current. The mountains are where rivers start, and they flow down into the valleys. If they went upstream, they would eventually get to a high point where they could see the horizon, figure out where they were, see smoke from another house, or any other sign of life. That was all they had, and it was a good plan. The climb was difficult. The cart wasn't made for rough ground, so they had to stop several times to pull the wheels out of holes or push when the horse couldn't do it on its own. The hours went by, or at least they seemed to, because the sun was still in that weird spot in the sky, not rising or setting completely. It felt like the day had stopped in the middle. The stream got smaller and smaller until it was just a trickle of water between the rocks. Then it went away completely, swallowed by the ground. They had gotten to the source, but there was no mountain, no view, and just more forest. This part of the forest was the only one that was different. The trees here were dead, gray trunks with no leaves, no life, and they looked like giant skeletons rising up against the sky. And in the middle of those dead trunks were marks, deep cuts in the wood made with a sharp tool. They weren't just random. They made the same shapes that were carved into the burned wood the man still had against his chest. The same geometric shapes were repeated on tree after tree, as if someone had left a message there that they couldn't read. The woman started to cry softly, not because she was sad, but because she was emotionally drained. They were stuck in a place that didn't follow the rules, being chased by something they couldn't see or understand, and every step they took seemed to make the mystery worse. Her husband hugged her, feeling the same weight as she did, but trying to keep some hope alive. That's when they heard footsteps coming from somewhere among the dead trees. They weren't their own footsteps. They were slow, purposeful footsteps getting closer. The couple didn't move or breathe. They just listened. The footsteps stopped, and then they heard a voice in the quiet that followed. They couldn't understand the words. It sounded more like a whisper, but it was definitely a human voice or something that wanted to sound like one. The murmur went on, and it sounded like it came from a lot of different places at once, bouncing off the dead tree trunks. It was impossible to understand the words, but they had a beat to them, like an old song or a prayer that had been forgotten. The couple stayed still, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. The voice sounded very close at times, like it was whispering next to them, and at other times it sounded far away, like it was coming from deep in the woods. The man pointed to the woman and told her to slowly walk back to the cart. They moved in time with each other, being careful not to step on dry branches that might make noise. The horse stood still, ears forward, and looked like it was aware of something they couldn't see. The voice stopped suddenly when they got close to the animal. The silence that came after was even scarier than the whisper. They held their breath and waited, but nothing happened. There was no sound or movement in the trees. It was like everything that was there had just disappeared or was waiting to see what they would do next. The man got on the cart and helped the woman get up too. They had to move. It was worse to stay still than to go the wrong way. He led the horse through the dead tree trunks, picking the path that looked the most open. The light was changing again, getting more golden, like the day was finally coming to an end. But how long had it really been since they woke up? Hours? A full day? Their stomachs were growling with hunger, but neither of them had the guts to stop and eat. The dead trees gave way to a place with low plants, scrub, and tall grass that rubbed against the wheels of the wagon. The ground was flatter here, and for the first time since waking up in that strange clearing, they could see a little farther. There was something that looked like a building on the horizon, hidden among the plants. It could have been another cabin or an old barn. From far away, it was hard to tell. The woman pointed to the building, and her husband shook his head. They didn't have a lot of choices. They could either go toward it and risk finding out what it was, or they could keep wandering around until night fell again. The thought of spending another night there, especially after what had happened the first time, was too much to bear. The structure became clearer as they got closer. It was a house, but it was different from the cabin where they had slept. It had 2 stories and a large veranda that went all the way around the front. The wood was old and worn, some of the planks were loose, and the windows were dark, like empty holes. There was no smoke coming from any of the chimneys, which meant there was no life. It looked like it had been empty for years. They stopped the cart at a safe distance and got out. The man picked up a piece of wood from the ground. It wasn't a weapon, it was something solid to lean on and hold on to. They walked slowly to the porch, and the wooden steps creaked under their feet. The front door was open a little bit, and the wind that had started to blow made it sway. The house was a mess inside. The furniture was broken, the curtains were ripped, and the table was turned on its side. It looked like it had been left behind quickly, as if the people who lived there had fled and never come back. But there was something strange. There was no dust, even though everything was broken. It was too clean for a place that had been empty for so long. The woman went into the kitchen while her husband looked around the living room. There were a lot of plates in the sink, and the food on them looked like it was still good. The stove had a pot with half a pot of water in it. There were glasses on the table, and one of them fell over. It looked like someone had been there not long ago, maybe even that day. But who would leave everything like that, and why? The man went up the stairs to the 2nd floor, and each step creaked under his weight. There were 3 locked doors in the upstairs hallway, which was narrow and dark. He opened the first door and saw an empty room with only a bed and a broken window that let the wind in. The second door opened to reveal something similar, another empty room with walls that were peeling. But the third door was closed. He turned the doorknob a few times and pushed with his shoulder, but the door wouldn't move. There was something over there. He could feel it, not a specific sound but a presence, like when you know someone is watching you but can't see them. He put his ear to the wood and listened. He could hear breathing. On the other side, someone was breathing. He jumped back, his heart racing, and ran down the stairs. He saw the woman still in the kitchen looking at the dishes. He took her arm and spoke softly but urgently, saying they had to go right away. She didn't ask him anything. She could tell from the look on his face that something was very wrong. They ran back to the cart after going out the front door, but just as they were about to go upstairs, they heard the front door slam shut. They both turned around and saw that the front door, which they had left slightly open, was now completely closed. There was someone on the porch, standing still and watching them. It was hard to see details in the distance and with the changing light, but it looked like a tall man in dark clothes. The couple didn't want to see anything else. They got into the cart, and the man cracked the reins, which made the horse run away. They got in their car and drove away from that house as fast as they could. The cart rocked back and forth on the bumpy ground. The figure was still there, in the same place, just watching them run away when they turned around. They rode on for an unknown amount of time, crossing grassy fields and going around thick woods, always moving. The sky was really starting to get dark, and they were scared of having to spend another night outside, but they couldn't stop near that house. They needed to find a different place, any place that looked safe. It got dark quickly, so they had to slow down. The horse was tired, with foam at the corners of its mouth and heavy breathing. They stopped in a small clearing that was different from the one where they had woken up, but it was still surrounded by trees. They didn't start a fire because they were afraid it would draw attention. They just wrapped themselves in their blankets and lay awake with their eyes open, watching the shadows move between the trunks. It was a long night with no sleep. Every sound made them jump, and every time the trees moved, it seemed like a threat. But nothing happened. There were no strange voices, no figures coming out of the dark, and no cabins that appeared or disappeared. Only the wind and the rustling of leaves. They got up and got everything ready to go as the first light of dawn began to brighten the sky. The man looked at the burned wood he still held close to his chest. It was cold now, without that strange warmth. The carved symbols looked less clear, as if they were fading away. He showed it to the woman, and they both thought the same thing. That place was making things disappear, hiding evidence, as if it wanted no one to ever know what really happened there. A thick fog rolled in during the morning, covering the ground like a sea of milk. The couple decided to go ahead and let their gut feelings guide them. The horse walked slowly, taking care with each step, as if it could tell that something in the area wasn't safe. The trees looked like ghosts as they came out of the fog. You could only see their shapes when they were a few meters away. The woman noticed something strange in her own thoughts while she was walking in silence. The memories of the cabin where they had slept were getting fuzzy, like they belonged to someone else. She could remember that they had gone into a room, seen a fireplace, and slept under blankets, but she couldn't remember the exact details. What were the walls like when she tried to pay attention to them? How many windows were there? She couldn't be sure of her answer anymore. She told her husband about it, and he admitted that he felt the same way. It was like that place was slowly taking away his memories and replacing them with doubts. He touched the burned wood again, but this time it was almost smooth. The carvings were now just small marks that could be anything. In a few more hours, there might be no proof that those symbols ever existed. As the sun came up, the fog started to clear, and they could see that they were on a real dirt road with deep wheel tracks and even some horse hoof prints. They felt a huge amount of relief. Roads take you to places, people, and civilization. They went in the direction that looked like it was used the most and kept going with new hope. The road twisted and turned between low, overgrown hills. They saw signs of normal human activity for the first time in days, or what seemed like days. A broken fence here, a stone marker there, and even side trails that looked like they led to farms nearby. They started to think that maybe they had finally gotten away from that nightmare because the world was starting to make sense again. But this sense of normalcy didn't last long. While they were driving, they started to notice something strange. They weren't following the wheel tracks of a lot of different carts, like you would expect on a busy road. The tracks were always the same, going around and around, as if the same cart had gone by many times or as if they were following their own tracks. The man stopped and got out to look at the tracks more closely. There was something different about them. One of the wheels was uneven, which left a unique pattern in the dirt. It was exactly the same pattern as the wheel on the cart itself, the one with a small crack on the rim. They were following their own tracks. But how? They were sure they had never traveled that road before. The woman got down as well and walked a little ahead, examining the terrain. The tracks continued, always the same, following the road that disappeared around a bend ahead. It was impossible, but it was there, proven in the earth. They looked back at the path they had come from and saw the same tracks. They were trapped in a loop, following themselves endlessly. The man started to panic. He climbed onto a large rock beside the road, trying to see further, searching for any landmark that would help them orient themselves. He could see past the nearby hills from the top, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The hills, trees, and shapes of the land were all the same, like reflections in a mirror that never ends. He got out and told the woman what he had seen. The two stood there in the middle of the road, trying to process what it all meant. They were trapped not only in that place, but in a distorted version of reality, where space and time no longer functioned as normal. Every step they took could be leading them back to their starting point. Every option could be useless. That's when they heard the sound of hooves approaching, coming from the opposite direction on the road. A horse appeared, trotting, pulling a cart. But as the figure drew closer, horror set in. It was their own horse pulling their own cart, and in it, seated exactly as they were now, were themselves. Two versions of the same couple approaching each other on the road. The original couple stood paralyzed, watching their doubles approach. The other version of them also stopped and looked shocked and disbelieving. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the two pairs stared at each other, living mirrors of one another. Then, without any sound or sudden movement, the double version began to fade, becoming translucent like smoke, until it vanished completely. The woman fell to her knees and shook. This was too much. It was too much for her mind to handle, to see herself and know that they were somehow meeting in that impossible place. Her husband helped her up, but it was hard for him to keep his cool. They had to leave before they completely lost their minds. They left the road and went straight into the bush, not following any path. If the roads kept going in circles, maybe the best thing to do was to leave the paths that were already there. The cart often got stuck in the thick plants, and they had to get out and push or cut branches with a knife they had with them. The sun was weird again. It was in the same frozen spot in the sky that they had seen before. They knew they couldn't trust the weather anymore. They didn't know if it was morning or afternoon, and they didn't know how many hours or minutes had passed since they saw their twins. Everything around them was broken up. They finally reached a deep valley with steep stone walls on both sides. A layer of mist covered the valley floor and stayed there like a thick carpet. Like islands in a white ocean, the tops of trees could be seen through the mist below. There was only one way down, and it was a narrow path that went back and forth along the rock. They didn't want to go down into that fog after everything they had seen, but when they tried to follow the edge of the valley to find another way, they saw that the valley curved around them, blocking any other way. They could either go down or go back to where the impossible road was waiting for them. They went down very carefully, and in some places the cart slid dangerously. The descent seemed to go on forever, with each turn showing more trail, rocks, and distance to the bottom. When they finally got to the bottom of the valley and into the fog, it closed in around them like a curtain, blocking everything except a few meters in front of them. The temperature dropped a lot. Their breath made white clouds, and even though they were wrapped up in blankets, they started to shake with cold. It was like the fog absorbed all the sounds, making them sound muffled. The horses' footsteps were almost silent. They found the others in the fog. There were people moving around among the trees, their shapes appearing and disappearing in the mist. They didn't seem to notice the couple and just kept walking in circles, not really going anywhere. The woman had to cover her mouth to keep from screaming when one of these figures got close enough to see clearly. The figure was an older version of herself, with gray hair and clothes that had seen better days. She walked with a blank look on her face, lost in the fog. She might have been stuck in that valley for years. And she wasn't the only one. Other people showed up, all different versions of themselves at different ages, all stuck or lost, and all walking in that foggy prison forever. The man pulled on the reins hard, which made the horse stop completely. They couldn't keep going through the fog with those ghostly versions of themselves walking around. It was like looking into a terrible future, the end that awaited them if they couldn't get away. The woman held on to her husband's arm, and stared at one of the figures that looked eerily like her, but had decades of tiredness written all over its face. They had to leave that valley, but how? The stone walls were too high for the cart to climb, and leaving the horse and their few things behind would make them even more vulnerable. The man looked around for anything that might show him how to get out. At that point, he saw that the fog wasn't all the same. There were currents in it, and small movements that made it look like the air was moving in a certain direction. He got out of the cart and walked a few steps, feeling the cold mist on his face. Yes, there was definitely a current, like the air was being pulled somewhere, maybe a crack in the rocks, an opening, something that could carry them out. He went back, got back in the cart, and led the horse toward the current, following the mist's almost imperceptible movement. The figures kept coming and going, but they started to change. Now they weren't just older versions of the couple. There were also other people. Strangers in clothes from different times, all with the same lost and empty look on their faces. How many people had been stuck there over the years? How many were still lost and couldn't find their way out? One of the figures got closer than the others. The man was wearing clothes that looked like they were from the last century or so. He reached for the cart and moved his mouth as if he were trying to talk, but no sound came out. There was a look of pleading and despair in his eyes. The couple sped up and didn't touch anything, scared that touching one of these ghosts would also trap them in that world. The fog started to lift, and they saw that they were climbing again. The ground slowly rose, taking them out of the valley floor. Hope came back to life. Maybe they had finally found a real way out, a way to get past the warped dimension where they had been stuck. But when they finally got out of the fog, what they saw made them realize that things were even stranger than they had thought. They were back in the same clearing where they had woken up that first impossible morning. The trees were in a perfect circle. The tall grass was in the middle, and even the sun was in the same spot. It was as if all the time they had spent wandering and all the places they had seen had been one big loop that ended exactly where it began. The woman started to laugh, but it was a laugh that came from being tired mentally. They had walked for days, seen things that couldn't be real, met versions of themselves, and in the end, they were back where they started. The husband didn't find it funny. He got off the cart and walked to the middle of the clearing, looking for any clues they might have missed before. He saw it then. There was a mark in the ground, right in the middle of the clearing. It wasn't normal. It was a perfect circle, the size of a barrel lid, where grass didn't grow. The ground inside this circle was darker, almost black, and felt strange, like it had been melted glass that had then hardened. He got down on one knee and touched the surface. It was cold, colder than it should have been, and completely smooth. When he pushed with his fingers, the ground felt like it was giving way a little, as if there was something empty underneath. He called out to the woman and looked at her. She came, still shaking, and they both started to dig around the dark circle with their hands. The dirt came off easily, as if someone had made it loose on purpose. They had uncovered what looked like a metal lid that had been corroded by time but was still strong in just a few minutes. There were hinges on one side and an iron ring on the other. It was a hatch, something that had been buried on purpose in that spot, under the clearing where they had slept without knowing it. With a loud creak of rusty metal, the lid flew open when the man pulled the ring. The steps of a stone staircase that went down into the dark were worn down by time. A cold wind blew up from below, bringing with it the smell of wet dirt and something else, something old and forgotten. They looked at each other, knowing this could be a trap, but also feeling that all the answers they needed were down there. The woman took a lantern from the cart, and the man found some dry twigs to make a torch. They started to go down with the light in their hands. The steps were uneven, and some were almost completely worn away. The stone walls around them were covered in wet moss. With each step, the air got thicker and pushed against their chests. The staircase led down to a room below ground. It wasn't very big, maybe the size of a small room, but the walls were covered in symbols. These were the same symbols they had seen on the charred wood and dead trees, but now they were carved into the rock in neat rows. There was a stone table in the middle of the room, and on it was a book. The book was in surprisingly good shape for how old it looked. The cover was dark leather, had no title, and was held shut with a metal clasp. The man walked up slowly and touched the surface. The leather was warm and pulsed like it was alive. He looked at the woman, and she nodded. They had gone too far to go back now. He opened the book and saw that the pages were full of handwritten writing in the same strange language as the symbols. But as he looked, the words started to move around and change, turning into Portuguese that he could read. The book seemed to change to fit the reader, translating itself on its own. What was written was scary. The book said that place wasn't just a regular forest. It was a kind of crossroads between realities, a point where the fabric of the world was thin and where other dimensions bled into this one. The cabin they saw wasn't a real building. It was a manifestation that seemed to draw travelers in and keep them in that never-ending cycle. There were instructions, rituals, and ways to get away in the book, but there were also warnings. People who tried to leave left behind pieces of themselves, like memories, time, and even pieces of their own lives. That was why they had seen different versions of themselves walking around. They weren't ghosts or illusions. They were parts of themselves that they had already left behind in other escape attempts that hadn't happened yet. In that place, time didn't go in a straight line. The man kept reading, looking for the answer and the way out, and he found it, but it cost a lot. One of them would have to stay behind to close the portal and seal the passage, but not forever. The other person could only follow after that, and both would go back to their normal lives, but anyone who stayed would have to face whatever was in that middle space alone, even if it was only for a short time. The woman read over his shoulder and tears filled her eyes. They had come together, survived together, and now they would have to break up, even if it was only for a short time. The man put the book down and hugged her. He felt the weight of the decision they would have to make, but at least they knew there was a way out and that they weren't completely lost. They climbed the worn steps back to the surface and came out into the clearing where the sun still shone in that same spot. They had to make a choice quickly. The book had made it clear that the longer they spent in that place, the harder it would be to keep their identity intact. The choice was like a stone on their chests. They sat side by side on the edge of the open hatch, staring into the darkness they had just left behind. The book remained down there, waiting, its pages holding secrets they could barely comprehend. The woman held her husband's hand tightly, as if she feared he might disappear if she let go for a second. They talked quietly about what they had read. The instructions were complex, full of specific details about positioning, the exact moment, and the words that needed to be said, but the essence was simple and cruel. One of them would descend back into the chamber, remain in the exact center of the circle of symbols, while the other would walk out of the clearing in a specific direction marked by the stars as night fell. The person who stayed would have to recite the words from the book, words in an ancient language that they couldn't even pronounce correctly during rehearsals. The process would take time, perhaps hours, and during that time, whoever was in the chamber would be exposed to everything that inhabited that space between worlds. The book didn't specify exactly what might happen, but the illustrations on the edges suggested presences, entities that wandered through those intermediate dimensions, drawn to human consciousness like moths to a flame. The man insisted that he would stay. It was natural for him, raised with the idea that he should protect, that his role was to face danger while keeping others safe. But the woman refused. She argued that she had a better memory, that she would be more able to remember the exact words, the precise sequence of gestures described in the book. And there was truth to that. He knew she had always been better with details, with following complex instructions. They argued for an immeasurable amount of time, each trying to convince the other to accept the safer role. But eventually they reached a different agreement. They would go down together once more, read the book again, more slowly, until they both memorized everything perfectly. Then they would decide at the last moment, based not on who was braver or more capable, but on who felt more prepared at that specific instant. They returned to the underground chamber, this time carrying more light, more firewood for the torches. The book awaited them on the stone table, seemingly untouched. But when they opened it, they realized that some pages had changed. New diagrams had appeared, more detailed illustrations showing the correct positioning, hand gestures, even a representation of the night sky with the constellations they needed to use as a guide. They studied each page with meticulous care, repeating the words aloud until they could pronounce them without stumbling. The words were strange, seeming to come from a time long before any modern language, and left a metallic taste in their mouths when spoken. The woman noticed that her voice echoed differently when she pronounced those ancient syllables, as if the walls themselves were responding. As they studied, they began to notice more details about the chamber that had gone unnoticed before. The symbols on the walls weren't just decorative. They told a story. Reading from left to right, top to bottom, they pieced together a narrative about travelers who had passed through that place over the centuries. Some had managed to escape, others hadn't, and those who failed remained trapped, their fragmented essences scattered throughout the distorted space. One of the images showed something particularly unsettling. It was a representation of multiple versions of the same person, all connected by thin lines like a web. The central figure was complete, solid, but the others around it were progressively more transparent, more empty. It was a visualization of what happened when someone spent too much time in that place. Pieces of their existence broke off, creating echoes, shadows that continued to wander even after the original person had left or ceased to exist completely. The man touched one of the lines on the wall and felt a tingling sensation run up his arm. It was like touching static electricity, but deeper, more fundamental. The woman pulled him back, warning that it wasn't safe to interact directly with the symbols outside of the prescribed ritual. They needed to follow the instructions exactly as written, without improvisation, without curiosity that could lead them to make fatal mistakes. They spent hours in that chamber, or at least what seemed like hours. Time continued to behave strangely even down there, sometimes seeming to speed up, sometimes to drag on. They practiced the ritual movements, walking along the specific pattern on the floor, touching exact points on the walls in the correct order. It was almost like a dance, each step precise, each gesture deliberate. Eventually, they felt they were ready, or at least as ready as they could be. They climbed back to the surface and found that the day had finally progressed. The sky was beginning to darken for real now, not that false darkness they had experienced before, but a genuine twilight with stars beginning to appear. It was almost beautiful, if it weren't for the terrible context. They prepared everything they would need. The woman filled canteens with water from the nearby stream. The man checked the condition of the horse and cart. Whoever was to leave the clearing needed to be prepared for a journey of no return, at least not until the ritual was complete. They shared a simple meal with what remained of their provisions, eating slowly, savoring each bite as if it were their last. While they ate, they talked about their lives before all this began, about the plans they had, the places they wanted to see, the things they dreamed of doing. It was a melancholic but necessary conversation, a way to anchor themselves in who they were before that place tried to erase their identities. They remembered why they had fallen in love, the little things that made them laugh, the difficult moments they had overcome together. The man used the diagram they had memorized from the book to figure out which stars were which when they became bright enough. The 3 stars that made up the triangle in the sky pointed in the opposite direction from the base of that triangle. He pointed, showing it to the woman, assuring her that she also knew exactly where to go if she were the one to leave the clearing. At that moment, when the stars were shining brightly, the choice became clear. She looked into her husband's eyes and just knew. He also knew. There was no more talking or arguing. She would stay not because she was stronger or more ready, but because she was sure at that moment that it was her job. And no matter how much he wanted to argue, he knew that it was true and respected it. They hugged for a long time, taking in each other's warmth, scent, and the feeling of being together. Both of them had tears in their eyes when they broke up, but they were also determined. They were going to make it work. They had no other choice, but the most important thing was that they had each other, even if it was only for a short time. The woman went down into the room one last time, bringing extra torches and the book she had chosen to take with her to make sure she understood everything. The man stood at the top of the hatch and watched her go down the worn steps. He waved when she got to the bottom and looked up. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. He started to close the hatch after she waved back, but he stopped halfway. He had something to say, something that couldn't be left unsaid. He called her, and his voice echoed down the stairs. He told her that he would always come back to her no matter what happened or how long it took. He would come back, even if he had to cross 1,000 impossible forests or face whole dimensions of terror. And she said she knew, down there in the dark where the torches lit it up. She always knew. He closed the hatch all the way, and the metal creaked one last time before it snapped into place. Then, following the instructions, he covered it with dirt, leaving only a small mark that only he would see. He got into the cart, looked at the stars again, and then led the horse out of the clearing. He didn't turn around. The instructions made it clear that looking back would break the ritual, leaving them both stuck forever. So he kept looking straight ahead, following the star's path, while the clearing behind him disappeared into the trees. The woman opened the book and started to read in the underground chamber below. Her voice was steady as she carefully pronounced each old word and walked along the pattern on the floor as she was told to. The walls started to glow softly, and as she finished each step of the ritual, the symbols lit up one by one. And she could feel things coming closer in the dark beyond the torches, drawn by the energy being released. But she didn't stop. She didn't think twice. She kept reading, walking, and doing her job so that they could both eventually find their way home. The man walked through the woods with a broken heart but a clear mind. The trees around them looked different now, less scary, as if the ritual had already begun to change the place. The shadows still moved between the trunks, but they didn't feel like they were always watching. The horse also seemed calmer. It trotted at a steady pace and didn't show any signs of being nervous like it had before. He kept his eyes on the stars and changed direction whenever the trail made him go off course. The book made it clear that he needed to stay on course as closely as possible, because even a small change could add hours to the time his wife would have to spend alone in that room. He felt sick at the thought of her being down there, surrounded by glowing symbols and unseen beings, but he trusted her strength and her ability to do what needed to be done. The forest slowly started to change. There were fewer trees and less dead plants on the ground. He could see farther now, distinguished shapes on the horizon, and for the first time since they had woken up in that impossible clearing, he began to see signs that they were approaching the normal world. A broken fence here, obviously built by real human hands. A pile of stones there, perhaps marking an ancient property boundary. But the biggest change was in the air. He could tell that the wind was different by the way it smelled. The air was no longer still and heavy like in the enchanted forest. It was real air, with smells of pine trees, dirt after a recent rain, and even a faint smell of wood smoke from faraway civilization, with real people living real lives. He sped up his horse because he wanted to cross the line between the impossible and the real, but he made himself stay on the right path. He couldn't let his hurry ruin everything now that they were so close. The book had said that the last few minutes were the most important, when the urge to stray would be strongest. And the temptation came. He saw lights to his right. Not the cabin's fake light that had gone out, but several clear and steady lights that could only come from a city or village. He wanted to turn that way with every fiber of his being, to get help, to find people, but he stayed on course, trusting the book's instructions and the ritual his wife was doing. The lights went out behind him, but he kept going in the direction the stars told him to. The ground started to rise, making a small hill with tall grass on it. He stopped for a moment when he got to the top and looked back, not at the clearing he had just left, but at the whole forest. From a distance, it looked like any other stretch of woods on the Missouri hills, lit up by the stars. There was nothing about it that hinted at the horrors inside. He went down the other side of the hill, and that's when he felt it. A big change in the world around him. He felt the change all over his body, like stepping through a curtain of cold water. The air felt lighter, the colors were brighter, and even in the dark the sounds were clearer. He had gone to the other side. He had left that strange place and come back to the real world. He felt so much better that he almost passed out. His hands shook as he held the reins, and he had to stop the cart to get it back under control. But the relief didn't last long before it turned into a lot of worry. He was gone, but what about his wife? Was the ritual doing its job? Was she okay? He didn't know yet. He would have to wait until morning, according to the instructions. He wouldn't know if the ritual had worked until the sun came up. He could only trust and wait until then. He found a flat spot next to the trail, lit a small fire, and sat down for the longest vigil of his life. The hours went by slowly. He took care of the fire, looked up at the stars as they moved across the sky, and thought about his wife. He pictured her in the room, saying those old words, walking the right way, and standing up to whatever might happen. He prayed, which he hadn't done in years, to any higher power that might be listening to keep her safe while he waited. He started to doubt his own memory. It seemed like the things that had happened in the last few hours or days, or however long it had really been, were getting more and more unclear. He could still picture the cabin, the clearing, and the underground room, but the details were getting fuzzy. It was just like the book said, the price of passage, memories left behind, and pieces of experience that couldn't fully return to normal life. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the campfire and started to draw on the ground next to him. He drew everything he could think of, like the chamber, the symbols, and the hatch. He wrote it down before it was gone for good. They were rough sketches, but they helped him remember things by giving him something real to hold on to while the memories tried to fade away. A thin band of bluish light began to grow in the east, and the sky began to get lighter. He stood up, and his muscles hurt from sitting for so long. He looked back at the forest, which was now just a dark mass against the brightening sky, and waited, his heart racing for some sign that everything had gone well. The light got brighter, turning the world pink and gold, and then he saw her. A figure coming out of the trees, stumbling a little but definitely walking toward him. He left the cart behind and ran through the tall grass. As he got closer, he could see that it was his wife, covered in dirt and tired but alive and real. They met in the middle of the field and hugged each other so tightly that it hurt. She was shaking, but not because she was cold. She was relieved and tired. He held her and whispered meaningless words of comfort. He was just happy to have her back. He saw that she had changed when they were far enough apart to look into each other's eyes. Her eyes had a different look, as if she had seen things that no one else should have seen. She tried to talk, but her voice came out almost lost. He brought her back to the cart, gave her water, and covered her with blankets. She drank slowly, wetting her throat, and then she started to tell her story. The ritual had worked, but it hadn't been easy. The people she had felt in the room had gotten closer and closer as the process went on. She had never seen them in person, but she could sense their interest, their need to know what she was and touch her. She said that there was a time when she almost gave in to fear. The walls seemed to be closing in on her, and the symbols were so bright that she could barely see. But she kept going, word by word, step by step, trusting the process even though every instinct told her to run. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The light went out, the presences receded, and the hatch above her opened by itself. She had climbed up to find the clearing empty, the sun rising, and no sign of the twisted forest that had trapped them. Instead, there was just a normal undergrowth that made it easy for her to see the way back to the real world. She had followed that path and had found him waiting. They sat there for a long time, just thinking about what had happened. The sun was now high in the sky, and it brought warmth and light to the area. The world went on as usual, not caring about the nightmare they had just lived through. The wind blew softly, and the birds sang. Things went on as they always did. Finally, they got up and got the wagon ready to go on their way. They looked back at the forest they had just come out of one last time. It was now just a green blur on the horizon. Some of them wanted to think that it had all been a shared dream or a hallucination brought on by being tired or sick. But the charcoal drawings on the ground, the blankets they had brought from the cabin that had disappeared, and the memories they still had, even though they were fading, showed that it had really happened. The couple followed the road that was now clearly and distinctly in front of them. It was a real road with the tracks of different carts and horses. In a way they had almost forgotten was possible. The world had gotten its meaning back. There was nothing special about each tree or shadow. A shadow was just a lack of light. It was both comforting and strange, like they had forgotten how to live in a world where things worked normally. During the first few hours of the trip, they didn't say much. They both knew without saying anything that they needed time to think things over and get their minds back to normal. She often looked at her own hands, turning them over in the sun to make sure they were still solid and that she was still real and whole. The man did the same thing, touching things around him like the wood of the cart, the reins, and the horse's neck to ground himself. It was only when they started to meet other people that the strangeness of what they were going through became clear. A farmer with a cart full of hay passed by and cheerfully said hello, saying that the weather was good for traveling. He thought they were just another couple on the road on a normal morning. He didn't see the shadows in their eyes or feel the tension in their bodies. He had no idea how far they had come. They were polite and kept the conversation short and shallow. How could they explain? How could they explain what they had been through to someone who had never been through anything more than the normal, comfortable world? It would be like trying to explain colors to someone who was born blind, or music to someone who has never heard any sound. They stopped in a small village later to get food. The man took care of the horse and cart while the woman went into a store. She had to lean on the counter because she felt so disconnected inside, surrounded by neatly arranged shelves of everyday things like jars of preserves and sacks of grain. It was like she had forgotten what it meant to buy things, trade money for goods, and live in a structured society. Everything seemed both familiar and completely strange. A kind old lady who worked at the store asked if she was okay. The woman smiled and said she was just tired from the trip. The saleswoman nodded in agreement and said that the roads were hard to drive on right now because there was a lot of mud on the back roads. She held on to it like a lifeline, using the normal conversations about normal things to pull herself back to reality. The man finally spoke after a long silence when they left the village and continued their journey. He told them they needed to figure out what to do with what they knew and what they had been through. Should they let someone know? Do you want to warn other travelers about that place? Or should they keep it to themselves because it's too personal, too private, or too awful to talk about? The woman took a long time to think before she answered. She said that part of her wanted to scream and tell everyone she met to never, ever go near that forest or that hidden clearing. But another part of them knew that no one would believe them. People would think they were crazy, maybe even dangerous, and definitely not trustworthy. And even worse, if they told the story too well, they might get the exact kind of people who shouldn't go there: the curious, the doubters, and those who needed to see for themselves. They came to a middle ground. They wouldn't want to make a big deal out of what happened, but if they ever saw someone about to go that way in that part of the Ozarks, they would give them a quiet warning, a suggestion to take a different path, or a casual mention that those trails were especially dangerous. Small actions that could save lives without making them look bad or worse. As the days went by and they got farther and farther away from that area, the memories faded more and more. They didn't go away completely, but they became less clear and less important. It was like looking through glass that had been frosted. You knew it was there and could see the general shape, but the details were fuzzy. The man tried to draw the chamber's symbols several times, but each time he did, they lost more and more of their original meaning until they were just lines on paper that didn't mean anything. The woman realized that she couldn't remember the exact words of the ritual she had done. She remembered reading something and saying old syllables, but they were gone from her mind like dreams when she woke up. The thought that something so basic and necessary for her survival could just go away upset her, but it also gave her some comfort. Maybe it was better this way. It was better to forget than to keep that information forever. They finally made it to their original destination, the southern city where they planned to look for work. They stayed in a boarding house that wasn't very fancy. Their room was small but clean, and had a window that looked out over the main street. That first night, they both woke up several times in a panic to make sure the other was still there, and that everything was still real. They were sleeping in a real bed with 4 solid walls that wouldn't disappear until dawn. The days turned into weeks, and they started to get used to their new life. As he had planned, the man got a job at a sawmill. The woman started sewing for families in the area, fixing clothes and making new ones on request. They were living normal, simple lives, just like they had wanted when they started that fateful journey. They were very thankful for this normalcy. But there were times, usually when things were quiet, when something pulled them back. A certain pattern of shadows on the wall might make them think of the symbols in the room. On some nights, the wind sounded like the whisper they had heard among the dead trees. And sometimes they came back in dreams. They went back to that clearing, to that cabin that was real and not real, to that place between realities where time didn't flow right and where versions of themselves were still lost. They didn't talk about these dreams directly, but they both knew when the other had one. In the morning, there was a certain look and a slight tension that didn't go away for a few hours. This made them feel like the world around them was solid. And on those days, they were extra nice to each other and paid extra attention to each other, as if they were remembering what they almost lost and what they could still lose if they weren't careful. A traveler came to the boarding house one afternoon, a few months after they had moved in. He was going to go north, right through the part of the Ozarks where everything had happened. They looked at each other in a meaningful way. It was the first time they could keep their promise to quietly warn someone. While they were eating dinner, the man talked to the traveler and casually asked about his route. The man suggested other trails when the traveler talked about the ones he planned to use. He said he had heard that the area was hard to get around, that the trails were easy to get lost on, and that it would be safer to take the main road, even if it took longer. The traveler thanked him for the advice and said he would think about it. They never found out if the man did what they told him to do. The next morning he left, and they watched him walk down the road with a mix of hope and fear. Hope that he would choose the safest path, fear that he might not, and then someone else would have to deal with what they had to deal with. Things went on with life. They made friends in the city and became part of the community. People thought they were a quiet, hard-working couple who might be a little shy but were always there for others. No one knew that behind those normal faces was an experience that had completely changed how they saw reality. They knew deep down, and for good, that the world wasn't as solid as it looked, that there were hidden layers and folds where other things lived and waited. On the darkest nights, when the wind blew hard and the shadows moved in strange ways, they thought about the other people they had seen in that valley. These were wandering, lost figures, older versions of themselves and people from other times. How many of them were able to get away in the end? How many people were still stuck in that never-ending cycle? They shivered at the thought that some part of them might still be there, that the versions they had seen wandering might still be stuck in an endless cycle of repetition in some other layer of reality. It was a thought they couldn't prove or disprove, so it stayed with them like a shadow. But most importantly, they had each other. They had been through something that no one else would have gone through, and they had survived together what should have been impossible. This brought them together in a way that went beyond love. It was a bond formed by survival, made stronger by the horrible truth that reality was much stranger and less safe than most people thought. As life settled into its routine, the years went by. The couple stayed in that city and made a life that was both normal and amazing. To everyone who knew them, they were just like everyone else, but they had a secret that made them special. They got older together. Their hair turned gray and their hands were rough from work, but their eyes always had that strange shine that comes from seeing beyond the veil of everyday life. They would sit on the porch of their small house at night and watch the stars spin in the sky. One of them would whisper about the 3 stars that made up a triangle. Even without looking, the other person always knew which ones they were. They were like landmarks carved into their souls, signs of a journey that no map could ever show. They never went back to that area, not because they were afraid, but out of respect. There were places in the world that should be left alone, and borders that should only be crossed once in a lifetime. They had paid their dues, left their pieces behind, and earned the right to move on without looking back. They would sometimes talk about what they had found late at night before bed. Was it something old that had always been there? Or something that came and went over time, like a door that opened and closed according to rules they didn't understand? They never found answers, only more questions. But talking about their fading memories made them feel better, knowing they weren't the only ones going through it. The man had carried the burned wood for so long that it finally fell apart. He put it in a small box, and one day he opened it and found only ashes. The symbols were gone completely, leaving behind the last physical evidence of what he had been through. But oddly enough, this brought peace, as if that object were the last real link to that place, and its destruction finally freed them from ever being pulled back. They sometimes ran into other travelers who were planning routes through the faraway mountains. They always offered their helpful suggestions for other paths, but never with a sense of urgency that might raise suspicion. They just spoke with the casual wisdom of people who knew the roads. And every time they did this, they wondered if they were saving lives or just putting off meeting the inexplicable. Many years later, they passed through that area one last time. They didn't mean to, But things happened that took them on a trip that brought them close to those hills that they sort of remembered. They could have looked for that clearing, that hidden hatch, or that room with glowing symbols, but they didn't. When some doors close, they must stay closed. They stood at the edge of the woods and watched the trees sway in the wind instead. And for a second, just a second, they could have sworn they saw smoke rising between the branches, a thin line of pale gray against the sky. They looked at each other, and without saying a word, they understood each other. It was still there. It still worked the same way. It still waited for tired travelers looking for a place to stay. But it wasn't their problem anymore. They had gotten away. They had made it. They had made a life for themselves on the other side, and that was enough of a win. They turned their backs on the forest and went on their way. That part of their lives was over, and they would only tell each other the story on the darkest nights when the wind blew a certain way. And so the story ends. Not with clear answers or definitive resolutions, but with the simple truth that some mysteries are not meant to be fully understood. Some places exist on the fringes of reality, waiting, watching, attracting those who get lost at the wrong moment. And those lucky enough to escape carry with them not evidence or proof, but something deeper. The absolute certainty that the world is far stranger, far broader, and far more impossible than anyone could imagine, sitting safely in their home. If you've come this far with us, please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that will make you question what is real. And the next time you see smoke coming from a place you weren't expecting while driving down a deserted road, you might want to think twice before looking into it. Some doors are tempting precisely because they shouldn't be opened until the next.